Good morning. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this policy forum on making rights real, the challenges and rewards of international human rights work on the ground, co-sponsored by IPI, the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm grateful to our panelists and those of you who made it here this morning. And by the way, I'm told we have 8 visiting Swedish parliamentarians in the audience. Particular welcome to you. I'm grateful to you all for keeping faith with us this past week as we scramble to keep rearranging things in the light of the storm we're now calling Superstorm Sandy. IPI is delighted to be co-hosting this event because of our continuing interest in international human rights work, but also our commitment to providing a forum here in the UN, the New York UN community, for perceptions developed in the field, or as our title says, on the ground. In my 3 decades at the New York Times, I was both a foreign correspondent in the field, and I was also the boss in New York communicating with the staff of foreign correspondents. So I know the difficulties and the necessity of keeping those lines of communication open. And it's what we at IPI hope we are doing today. And we are grateful to the Mission of Sweden and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for giving us this chance. One housekeeping note, we are webcasting this event. And that webcast will become a video on our website later today or early tomorrow. In that connection, we ask that you silence your cell phones, though we don't need you to turn them off, because if you are a Twitterer, we encourage you to tweet this event. The tag, by the way, is IPINST, as in International Peace Institute, IPINST. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today, and since you have their full biographies attached to the blue participants list, I'm going to introduce them very briefly now before turning the discussion over to them. Making welcoming remarks will be Ivan Simonovic, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and head of OHCHR's New York office, and Frank Belfrage, Sweden's State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. We will then hear from Roger Nash of Fieldview Solutions, who will be walking us through the new report he co-authored called Influence on the Ground, Understanding and Strengthening the Protection Impact of United Nations Human Rights Field Presences. Following Roger Nash will be Jane J. Shigyal, the permanent representative of Micronesia to the United Nations, and Nestor Osorio, the permanent representative of Colombia. And finally, Christian Salazar Volkmann, who is the Deputy Director of the United Nations Children's Fund's Program Division in New York, and who previously led what is OHCHR's largest field presence in the world, located in Colombia. Our last speaker will be Marit Cohen-Sharif, the Deputy Director of the New York office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Once again, to all of you, a particularly warm welcome to IPI, and I now invite Assistant Secretary General Ivan Simonovic to start us off.
So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this exciting discussion on the research study and the book Influence on the Ground, Understanding and Strengthening the Protection Impact of United Nations Human Rights Field Presences. Let me start with thanks. Thanks to co-organizers of this event, to Government of Sweden as well, to IPI. But I would like also to extend my thanks to all those governments who sponsored this research project, and also to member states who hosted our researchers while they were doing the field work. This is an important contribution to systematization of experiences after 20 years of human rights field presences. It is especially important that it has been done by experienced and independent experts. I have academic background, and when I read books, and especially when they are based on research, I make comments. And I can say that this book has much fewer question marks and much more exclamation mark, meaning that's it, not how come. So what are the greatest contribution of this book? I would say that the major one is that it clearly reflects that human rights are not something abstract. It is decisive and determines quality of life of people all over the world. It accurately describes our work in the field, the problems related to human rights diagnostic, establishing the status of human rights in individual countries, prioritizing the actions taking into account limited human and financial resources, and dilemmas concerning course of action. Whether in a certain condition and in certain environment, in certain times, it is more appropriate to go for public reporting or to go for technical support. Usually it's a combination of the two, pending conditions of the country, whether human rights deficiencies can be attributed to lack of capacity or lack of political will. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. If we review the work of human rights field presences in 20 years, there were successes and failures. However, trend is quite clear. To human rights, there is more and more attention being devoted. Human rights field presences are expanding both in their scope and in their leverage. Just two anecdotes to illustrate that. It's a dialogue I had with two top security officials. Both of them were generals. One of them was very old and one of them was very young for that status. One was Iraqi and the other one was of Democratic Republic of Congo. When I discussed with this elderly Iraqi general human rights and their mainstreaming, he was very frank because he was very old, he has cancer, and he was leaving his duty. And he said, listen, I was raised in different spirit. I was raised in spirit of obligations and not rights. I cannot fully understand this concept of human rights, but I understand enough that I want it for my grandchildren. I want us to work together. The other discussion was with a rising star, a professional rising star, DRC police general. And what he said is, I want my police people to be proud. I want when they meet people on the street that they are cheered and greeted and not feared and hated. Let us work together. So in the next 20 years, I am convinced that the trend of human rights increasing leverage will continue. Let us therefore work together that through strengthening work of field presences, human rights really become in reality and not only in lip service the third pillar of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. And now Frank Belfrage, State Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Sweden.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the IPI for organizing this most timely event. And of course, to say the obvious, I'm very honored and delighted to be here today alongside with Assistant Secretary General Simonovic, as well as a panel of most distinguished speakers. I couldn't agree more than what Mr. Simonovic was just saying, that the protection of human rights is not only a question of protecting individual human beings, their life, their freedom, their future, but it's also key for promoting sustainable peace, democratic societies, and prosperity through development activities across the globe. This was the bearing line in his introduction and also in the book, which we are going to discuss during these events. All these elements, we feel, must go hand in hand if we are to succeed in our efforts to make rights real. The study that we will be discussing today, Influence on the Grounds, is in this respect both timely and very useful. It clearly shows that human rights work in the field has a real impact and is conducive for democracy and the rule of law. It's studies like this that provides us, donors, development partners, and you at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with concrete evidence of the impact that your work is having daily in the field, and unfortunately not always as highlighted as it merits to be. And that's why an event such as this one organized by the IPI is of such crucial importance. Spreading the word, spreading the experiences, showing the lessons learned through the study. Sweden is a long-standing and substantial supporter of the OHCHR, and we attach high importance to its fieldwork. We support a number of country offices. Colombia, Excellencies, is one of them. And in this context, we welcome the clear results-based management, which has now become a distinct feature of the OHCHR. Human rights should be mainstreamed in development cooperation at all levels. That's the key message of the study, and we couldn't agree more. A human rights perspective puts issues such as gender equality, non-discriminations, the right of the child, democracy, and so forth at the core. The same goes for participation, transparency, responsibility, and accountability. Our engagement in human rights at the international level must, of course, also be matched by a firm commitment to human rights protection nationally, notably through the constitutional and legal system. Dialogue with civil society, combined with regular and constructive scrutiny, is an important part of our work to move forward on human rights. To fully implement what has been called the Universal Periodic Review recommendations, as well as conclusions and recommendations from international human rights monitoring bodies, requires strong political will and commitment. We recognize that political will cannot achieve this alone, however. A lack of resources and capacity is often an obstacle to achieve the full enjoyment of human rights and to implement recommendations from international human rights monitoring body. And that's why we feel that capacity building in the human rights field in developing countries is an area where we, as bilateral donors and multilateral actors such as the OHCHR, have important roles to play, hand in hand with our development partners, and therefore bilateral and multilateral engagements are truly mutually reinforcing. It sounds as a banal truth, but we believe strongly that this is the case. To conclude, let me state that as far as Sweden is concerned, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, like other multilateral actors, possess the advantage of having a high legitimacy as defenders of the standards, norms and conventions that have been developed in intergovernmental consensus within the United Nations, and therefore the office can count on Swedish continuous support and commitment. I thank you.
Thank you, Frank Belfrage.
So thank you very much for coming. Thanks a lot for the very kind words. Thanks a lot to IPI for organising this, and particularly the Swedish mission here. About 20 years ago, UN human rights presences started to be placed into the field, and it was very quick that people realised that this made things fundamentally different. It's a very different thing to have somebody in your country working at a local level, working with communities, meeting with local police commanders, working with ministers, working with individual activists on the ground is a very different type of work from the type of work that happens in headquarters in Geneva, in New York, or at the international level with advocacy. And what we've seen over those 20 years is that the work in the field of UN human rights presences has evolved and changed, and it's grown over that period of time. So I want to just talk briefly about what those field presences are at the moment. Currently, there's UN human rights field presences in 58 countries around the world, over 1,000 staff. Now, that might sound like a lot, but if you compare that field staff size to something like UNHCR or UNICEF, it's really far, far smaller than those other agencies. Those presences come in different forms. There's country offices, there's regional offices, there's human rights components of peacekeeping missions, which makes up about 70 or 80% of those staff. And then there's human rights advisors working within UN country teams. I'll just very quickly show that where those things are geographically. You can see the red-brown ones are country offices. The Nepal office has just closed recently. The green figures are regional offices. The little blue triangles are human rights advisors. And these yellow circles are peacekeeping, human rights components of peacekeeping missions. You can see that there's a lot everywhere. These 58 presences span the whole world. There's a lot of human rights advisors in Europe and regional offices, headquarters there in Geneva of OHCHR, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, and in the rest of Africa. Okay. These presences haven't remained static, and they've grown over the last 5 years. This study that we've just completed really takes 2005 as its starting point. Here it's 2004 of where those presences existed at that point. After that moment, there was a plan of action put in place by the then High Commissioner to greatly expand the presence of UN human rights in the field. And you can see that that's really represented. There's far more regional officers, there's far more human rights advisors, and there's more than double the number of country officers. So that amount of growth also represents a growth of ideas. It's not just a geographical growth. There's been enormous innovation in that period of time. And what we've done in this study is tried to collect these ideas to work out what has been learned over this 20 years, what has particularly been learned in this 5 or 6 years of growth, and to say what is going on out there that is really making a difference to bringing protection for human rights on the ground. And how does it work, and how can it be done better? So what did we find? Well, actually, before I tell you what we found, I'll tell you what we did. We did 2 years of research. We did 4 major case studies in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nepal, and Uganda. We did other smaller field visits to a number of places. We did phone interviews with human rights officers based in about 20 countries, and we interviewed over 400 people. And those people weren't all human rights officers with OHCHR or with human rights components. They were also government officials, they were military officials, they were police, there was human rights activists, there was politicians, political commentators. We interviewed as many people as we could, civil society activists particularly, to get all the different perspectives on how it was working, how did it really work? Because one of the things that we knew before we started this research was that the work that happens in the field is really not very well understood. There's still a stereotype of human rights as something that's inherently controversial, that's about public statements, that's about gathering reports and publishing that. And certainly that's a very important part of most human rights work. But human rights work in the field relies much less on that than other kinds of human rights work. So what did we find? We found that, most importantly, we found that these field presences work. They make a difference to what's really going on. That we had a lot of people telling us about their personal experiences, about how their life had been changed by the work of a human rights presence. So I can't go into examples now, but this was very common. But it wasn't just from potential victims or past victims of violence or abuses that were telling us these things. We also heard similar things from governments, from military, from police, from almost everybody we talked to would tell us not either how their life had been changed or how they were behaving differently. What were they doing differently? How had the presence changed what they did? We had the opportunity to go to Nepal, where we talked about a lot of events that had happened 7 or 8 years earlier. And so we managed to interview very senior people who had been in the government at that time, very senior military people, very senior guerrilla commanders, to understand exactly how that presence had changed the dynamic of that conflict. And it was remarkable. It was a very serious change of the whole dynamic and also the behaviour of the different actors involved because of that international visibility and the particular work of that presence. So we found it works, but we also found that the way that it works is very different from the stereotype, that it's not about people in the field simply gathering data and sending that to headquarters and broadcasting that information. That this is a totally outdated model of how field human rights work works. We found that it was that was very important, but this idea of monitoring in this very pure form, and similarly a very pure form of technical cooperation where you sit in a government ministry and you just talk to people and do nothing else, that these elements are kind of threads of a much greater span of activity that was really going on. It wasn't really feasible to put the different activities into this is monitoring, this is technical cooperation, that even the lines between what was what were constantly blurring, and that the best work that was happening in the field was really objective oriented. It was based on analysis, it was based on certain goals and objectives, and then looking at all the different tools you have to try to achieve those goals. We also found that the applicability of these kinds of human rights field presences is much greater than simply in crisis situations. Now that's true, a lot of the human rights advisors are not in crisis situations, but most of the bigger ones did arrive in crisis, but then they found that they had a struggle with transition, that what was their relevance after that crisis subsided. And we found that generally there was very high relevance because human rights issues are often long-term issues. And you can't just turn around and say we don't deal with issues of discrimination and other things. But of course, the nature of the work will change, and the targets and the goals of the work will change. Now, how do the actual presences work? Well, we found that they combine a whole lot of different core assets, if you like, or infrastructure in order to have an influence to change what's really going on. And a key one is their ability to get out into rural areas, remote areas, and both to gather information and to create relationships. That's what everybody always thinks you're doing when you're doing out in the field, and that's very important. But it's not just gathering information. It's about the relationships that you're building and the dissuasive message that you're sending, your ability to communicate with potential abusers as to what their standards are that they're going to be held accountable to, your ability to encourage civil society activists that they are being watched. There is somebody who cares what happens to them. We had countless stories of people telling us how inspirational it was when they're working in a remote area that there's a UN presence coming over and asking them how they're doing, and how much impression that made, not just on the person themselves, the activists, but also on the people watching, the people who are threatening that person. That it makes a huge difference when there's seen to be interest from a so-called influential and important power or entity like OHCHR or UN Human Rights. This is a photo of Nepal. This is during a whole lot of demonstrations. There was a huge presence of OHCHR monitors there at these demonstrations. You can see here she's on the radio, but she's not on the radio to record, all the bad things that the government is doing. She's on the radio actually because they've designed a whole system of feedback where the police are getting feedback on their own response, so that there's a huge cooperation here with the police. It's not just a spying on the police, a double check on the police. This is actually assisting the police to be internally accountable so that they can actually strengthen their ability when there are particular problems. They can strengthen their ability to not go use excessive force, etc. This is Colombia, and this is the Congo. So you can see, we can just imagine what it means to have a UN presence in places like this. And it also gains a lot of credibility for both the presence and for the people that you're visiting. And we found that that was a particularly important element, because when you're the UN and when the UN human rights, a lot of your influence is derived from your perceived importance and your perceived ability to influence others. And we found that there was a real feedback loop, that when you do your job well, when you're seen as an impeccable source of information, as someone who doesn't have a particular agenda, who is clearly standing up for identified human rights standards and is very consistent about that, well, that tends to give you greater support. People can support that because they can understand what it is. And when people see that you are getting external support, either from the missions or from other international organisations, where you're a credible, powerful organisation, then that actually gives you far greater influence. One of the key elements to gaining that credibility is to know when to speak out, when you need to speak out, when things need some form of pressure. Now, that doesn't have to be a public report. It could be bilateral meetings. It could be using other elements of the UN, because it's not just the presence itself that can speak. It's about using the other tools at your disposal, including the special procedures who are visiting and the voice of the High Commissioner herself, for example. But this voice is not just useful on its own. We actually found there was a lot of fear sometimes to use the UN voice, because it might damage a relationship with the state. And I'll come to that more in a second. But it's absolutely essential to use it, because it's not just something that has influence directly. It's something that also creates, allows other actors, especially local actors, local civil society actors, international organisations, diplomatic missions, they can hide behind what you say. So if the UN says something, suddenly the civil society activists can say the same thing, and it's not as dangerous. So when you're doing the cost-benefit analysis of, do I speak out, do I maybe cause a bit of friction or not, you can't just think about your direct influence as the UN. You have to think also about the space that you're creating for others. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is not just go there to have a direct attributable impact. You're there to build long-lasting, sustainable systems of human rights protection in the countries where you work. So it's always about thinking about sustainability of the actions that you're taking. So this is a very simple and perhaps obvious model, but I think it's really important to see that when you're thinking about the sustainable situation of human rights in any given country, there are two primary actors in that. One is the state that has ultimate responsibility for protecting the people's human rights. But secondly, there's civil society. There's what we've labelled here the people. There's the ability of the population of a country to hold their particular state to account. You know, yesterday there was an election here, right? And this is a demonstration of democracy and expressing. Holding a government to account is not just through elections. It's through all of the other activities of different civil society groups, NGOs, trade unions, individual activists, everybody else who's exerting pressure on a government to ensure that it has the political will to maintain the human rights in that state. So what tends to happen is there's often a danger to focus exclusively on the state. And it's absolutely essential to be strengthening the state, cooperating with the state, but that's only part of it, because this dynamic, this interplay is something that a human rights field presence needs to nurture consciously, and that includes conscious support for civil society organisations and for their dialogue with the state. Now, I talked before about using the UN voice, and now I'm talking about supporting civil society. In a lot of countries around the world, a government might look at you and think that's a bit hostile thing to do. That, what are you doing supporting these people who criticise us? What are you doing criticising us directly? And we found, looking at all the different countries we went to, this was a really common concern because it's essential to have a constructive relationship with the state because you're not there as the enemy of the state. You're there as the constructive support for the state. So all the different human rights presences, how are they able to juggle this perception? And we found basically 5 different tools that different presences were using successfully in order to manage this relationship, to keep a relationship of respect, but at the same time where you're able to speak and have a clear identity in that relationship. So firstly, there was just plain old diplomacy. If you're speaking respectfully, if you're turning up when you say you're going to turn up, if you're treating people well and having a respectful dialogue, that's obviously a prerequisite to being able to have a constructive dialogue. Secondly, we found it was very important to have a problem-solving mentality, that too often either the human rights presence or the state itself can slip into this adversarial mindset, that you're there just to criticise. But when support is offered, when difficulties are identified, if a country has a problem with one particular technical area, if an expert can come in from overseas and say, okay, we've found an expert who can deal with particularly this area to support you, we've found that gains a lot of credibility with this state relationship, that you're not there just to poke holes, you're there to give constructive solutions. Thirdly, we found that having a broad network of contacts with the state was very important in order to not be totally reliant on one personal relationship here or there. That over time, if you have relationships not just at the national level, but at district level, at the level of different cities, you have personal connections, they can end up smoothing over any high-level tensions that occur because of big picture issues that are being discussed. Now, this was the most interesting one, I think, reliability and predictability. We found that states tended to feel aggrieved, they tended to feel like an organisation was being hostile to them when they got surprises, when they felt it was unfair, when they feel that somebody's criticising us, but we didn't see it coming. They didn't talk to us first. The standards they're using are arbitrary. But when you're in constant dialogue with the state, when they know what standards are being held accountable to, when they know when you're going to speak up, what you're going to say, when you talk to them in advance, when you have a clear identity of what you expect, then states understand that. And not just states, non-state armed groups as well. We found in Nepal, it was fascinating to ask guerrilla leaders or police who'd been heavily criticised, what did they think of those reports? And without exception, they said to us, well, we understood. They told us what they were doing. We understood why they were criticising us. So we have to get away from this dichotomy of you're hostile or you're subservient. It's not like you switch from one to the other. It's when you've got a reliable, predictable thing that you're identifying, this is what we do, this is what we stand up for, then people will understand criticism and states will respect that. And in the same vein, we found that often the presences that had the strongest relationships were the ones that actually were seen as serious players, that had influence, that had power, that the ones that were seen as a little bit too scared to speak up, that actually damaged their relationship because they weren't seen as powerful or interesting enough for a state to really engage with. So this was some of the more interesting stuff that we found, I thought. Now, if you look at what I've just been talking about and all the different pieces of it, you'll understand where I'm coming from this last slide here. That the most effective strategies that we saw were not just sending reports, they were not just giving technical advice, they were blending many, many different attributes. They were understanding an analysis of a particular situation. What is the dynamic? What is it we want to change? How are we going to do it? What are the relationships we need that you build up over time? How do you build up your credibility over time? How do you build up your exposure, your visibility over time? How do you have to understand the context you're working in. You have to be able to build relationships so that when you apply pressure, that pressure is understood and well targeted. And that's what gives you an effective presence, not by putting it into boxes and saying, this is monitoring, we're sending this report to New York or to Geneva. Now, when you consider a single activity. I think this is maybe the most illustrative of how this can really work. If you imagine a single human rights officer going to one remote location in Nepal or wherever it is, and they might be meeting with a police commander, they might be meeting with just going to a rural community as a visit, they might be visiting a civil society person. Any of those activities, one single activity, might be simultaneously aiming for 5 or 6 goals. You might be encouraging civil society, you might be sending a message of dissuasion, you might be communicating the standards of human rights that you expect, you might be raising visibility for an issue, you might be raising visibility for the office, you might be demonstrating your ability to respond if a crisis happens. There's a million things going on in every single interaction. So you can't just, not just that you can't partition it at the big picture level, you can't partition this work at the small picture level. If you're working in technical, I'll give another example. In the Congo, one of the things that the Human Rights Field Presence is doing is supporting logistically to bring a mobile court system where all the prosecutors, the judge, they all come along in a helicopter and they arrive in a very remote location and they dispense justice. They have a court hearing and they'll actually arrest people or they'll charge people, and those people will be convicted or released or whatever. And this has an enormous effect in terms of demonstrating to those people that there actually is some accountability for breaches of human rights, for abuses that happen. It's been astonishing in some places that people couldn't conceive that a police officer could ever be held to account. But it's beyond that immediate effect, because you might say this is technical support to the judicial system. But there's an implicit monitoring element there as well, that if you're investing all of this, people are on show, the people giving the decisions can't give corrupt decisions nearly as easily because there's somebody looking over their shoulder watching them. So it's very double-sided. There is no pure monitoring. The monitoring you do is there to motivate and drive these changes that you're supporting on the inside. And I think we have to get away from the idea that actually pressure is criticism, or pressure is negative, or pressure is hostile. Pressure is a support. If you're there as a constructive support for a state that really wants to do its best, it doesn't just need technical support, it needs a little bit of help to push through those internal obstacles to allow it to do its job properly. And I think the more transparent you can be with this, the easier it is to negotiate this relationship. And when we gave this same presentation in Geneva, we actually did it to a room full of representatives of different states. And we were really encouraged at how clear that was and how much that was understood. That we're able to get away from this idea that a report that might be critical or a discussion that might be pointing up an error, it doesn't have to be a defensive response. It can be a constructive response. And specifically when the human rights field presence itself is being constructive and supportive and not just trying to point the finger at what's going wrong. So after all of that, what do we have as recommendations? So it's really the same things that I've been saying, that these field presences have to be aware of and use the whole full toolbox of strategies that are available to them. And this toolbox has to be understood not just in the field, because at the moment there's field operations doing great work, but they're doing it, making it up each one on their own, mostly. And the idea is that this should be consolidated and standardised as normal, what everybody does. And so we found lots of great work out there, but now we want to make it standard and understood so that the people in Geneva, in New York, in the missions, everywhere else understands how this work happens and what it really is. We think that field presences need to take advantage of their unique identity as the UN. And that often means because you're the UN, you have a higher profile, a higher credibility, what you say matters, people will listen to that, and that gives you certain responsibilities. In some places we found that there was an undue fear of being public and being visible, but actually when you compromise on that, civil society activists will turn against you because they'll say, you're just doing what we could do. If you want to be here and do something special, you have to do the things that only the UN can do, which is the visibility, the safety they have to speak out, and you have to leverage those things. something I didn't get to expand on very much today, but the presences need to be able to deal with transitions for crisis and post-crisis, and there needs to be a more strategic understanding of how that's supposed to work. And we recommend that the whole system gets bigger, that there be more presences, that the presences that exist are bigger because the bigger ones are more effective, as we saw. And that there's huge need out there, and the general effectiveness of these presences is a recommendation that there's so much more opportunity to do good work out there. But beyond that, beyond just growing in this year or next, we also think there needs to be a more strategic, ambitious projection of what this field presence should look like in 20 years. You know, things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. We have the UPR, we have the Human Rights Council, we have many countries out there that have got open invitations to special procedures to visit them whenever they like. And the effectiveness of this field presences is such that we should be more ambitious about thinking about removing the label that having a field presence means there's something wrong in your country. Having a field presence means you're open to fixing the issues in your country. And this is a huge step that we need to take. And it's already happening, that people are recognising this, that the more that you're supportive of fixing any human rights issues in your country, the more open you'll be to having a presence, and the more that all countries should be available to being open to that situation. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you, Roger. We'll now call upon Jane Chigial, the permanent representative of Micronesia to the United Nations. And Jane, you can speak from right there, if you like.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Before I proceed, I would like to thank the government of Sweden for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion, and to IPI for organizing this important event. I thought it would be useful for me to just provide a brief description of my country, so you can get an appreciation of what I'm going to talk about. The Federated States of Micronesia has a federal system with 4 autonomous states. It has a population of over 102,000. A third of the population live on remote islands, and that makes it difficult for the government to provide services because transportation is usually by ship to these places. The islands are scattered throughout approximately 1 million square miles in the vast Western Pacific Ocean. As an oceanic island state, we are challenged by our smallness, remoteness, and dispersed, scattered islands in the Federation. With the foregoing description that I provided, I thought I should just touch on 4 interrelated issues. And I'm focusing on the UPR process that we had to go through as an example in our work in relations to OHCHR. And I thought those interrelated issues can be considered by the organization to see how we can work together. So the first issue that I identified is the internal coordination. Because it is a federation, it's very difficult to coordinate within the government because of the dispersed and scattered islands, and also the fact that the states have authority over issues such as education, health services, but the issue of reporting and our international obligation rests with the national government. So that challenge of coordinating and ensuring that we are meeting our obligation, it surfaces many times when we have to talk about human rights issues. The other issue that I wanted to touch upon is public education and capacity building. This has been shared in the reports and by other presenters. Human rights is not fully understood by those who have to develop policies or legislation to ensure that protection is provided. And by the majority of the citizens, it's also not understood. And it creates not a problem, but a challenge in holding the state accountable to providing those services, whether protection or social services or legal services. And it's very important that public awareness, education is continuous, and that it doesn't happen when we are close to the second period or phase of the UPR, because that was the experience that we had in the first exercise. All of a sudden, everybody, all the actors are there to help us, to educate us on how to report, how to do our report, and then after that, they're not around. But of course, the responsibility rests with the states. But the assistance and guidance is continuously needed. And when I say fully understanding human rights, I can use the example of climate change. Some of these issues are so subtle that we don't tend to think of them as human rights issues. With climate change, it threatens our food security, and then there is no access to food, quality drinking water, and we need to protect our right to development and the future of our people. The third area that I wanted to touch on is institutional strengthening and reformation. With the federal system that we have, most of the work in terms of international obligation is done at the national level. The same people that are involved in all other human rights reporting. So they're taxed, I guess you can say that with the many treaty obligations or the treaties that we are a member of, we use the same people to do to ensure monitoring or to do reporting. And I thought this area is important because we need to reassess how we should do this. In our UPR report, we thought of having a separate entity that has dedicated staff and budget, to do it instead of the same people doing it over and over again. But there is a need for collaboration, because with the lack of understanding of the issue, we need to have people that are versed in human rights, and for them to dedicate their time to the process, because it's a continuous process, and as has been mentioned, it has to be mainstreamed into development policies and legislation. The last point that I wanted to touch on is partnership. As we have seen in the map that Mr. Nash showed here, the Pacific is quite big. I'm not going to talk about, mileage from Fiji to my country, but just to say that it takes 2 days to travel from Fiji to Micronesia. So, with that information, you can also appreciate that the regional field office also they also have their own challenges in getting to all the 14 countries under their jurisdiction. And I raise that because I think there is also a need to be innovative and creative to use, for instance, we have a UN joint presence in Micronesia, and maybe that is an avenue that collaboration can be explored, that we don't get a visit once in a long while from the regional office, but they can use staff at the UN joint presence, to help us. And I know that in the 2013 UN Development Assistance Framework that we now have with the UN country team, governance is a focal area there, and that's why I raised the utilization of the UN joint presence, because for us we also need to, to continuously work with the UN and other actors involved in this work. I mean, we tend to rely on people with authority on an issue. And the UN joint presence, the three programs there are UNICEF, UNDP, and UNFPA. And so once in a while, I think people would like, the experts in that area to, to also do the education. And I say this because while it's a welcome, the assistance, for it to work, our government has to take ownership of the process, the importance of this issue. And political will has been, raised as an important element in this process. And I think political will can happen if our policymakers understand fully, the importance of human rights as a central foundation in the development agenda. So having having identified all those issues, I thought that I would share with the group the areas that I think technical assistance and training is needed. And I've mentioned some of them, and that's raising awareness with our leaders so there's political will. The civic, legal, and political education has to continue. Training on how to mainstream human rights into development, the development agenda. Training on developing the legislation on prevention, protection, and enforcement. Institutional establishment or strengthening. And the need for the visits to be done in all the states instead of just coming to the national government. I know that the budget constraints is a factor, but if public awareness is going to be raised, everybody needs to know about it, and the experts need to do that training in all the states. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now I call on Ambassador Nestor Osorio, the permanent representative of Colombia.
Thank you very much for the invitation that the Swedish Embassy, the United Nations Human Rights, and the International Peace Institute have made to me in order to make a presentation that tries to be as descriptive and informative as possible about how Colombia is evolving in this important matter of guaranteeing, respecting, and promoting human rights. Colombia shares the values of democracy, rule of law, and the observance of human rights, respect and guarantees for human rights are a central feature of the policies of the Colombian government. We are an open nation to the international surveillance, committed to both the United Nations and the Inter-American System of Human Rights, and I have to say that substantial progress has been achieved in cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Since 1997, Colombia has established an Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and in addition to the original mandate, my government has incorporated the advice of the Office for the creation of a National Center of Human Rights. Colombia has also 23 offices of the United Nations, including agencies, funds, and programs. And of course, we have a delegation of the Red Cross and the International Labour Organization. On a voluntary basis, Colombia presented the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations. I'm told, but this is to be verified, that we are the only country that has implemented a public follow-up to the 133 recommendations or voluntary compromises derived from the review. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has provided advice to the government in national initiatives of great importance, such as the Victims and Land Restitution Law that was published and dictated last year. By the way, at this occasion, when we launched the law, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was in Bogota, Colombia, to be a witness of this important piece of legislation that is now quite a reference for different countries in how to deal with the victims of conflicts and to those who has been displaced from their properties. This law was enacted in a framework of transitional justice that recognizes and dignifies the victims of the armed conflict and tries to guarantee their constitutional rights, establish judicial, administrative, social, and economic, individual, and collective measures in their benefit. Within the framework of cooperation and technical advice, the Office in Colombia has contributed with processes and projects at some of the ministries for the promotion of the protection of human rights in the creation of substantial entities for a better exercise of human rights and the analysis of situations that can affect the enjoyment of these human rights in Colombia. It has advised the national government in the establishment of the National Center for Human Rights in charge of the Vice President's Office, portraying experience to facilitate discussions on the basic duties of the center to address and follow up compromises to monitoring international recommendations. The office has also advised the Ministry of Defense in different projects and programs regarding the prevention of sexual gender violence against women and a policy of zero tolerance, the monitoring of the efficacy and impact of the measures taken by the government to eradicate the practice of extrajudicial executions, the implementation of a community process for the dissemination of the right of indigenous people and Afro-Colombian communities to prior consultations, elaboration of analytical documents in regard to the intelligence law and the Bill of Technical Defense for those members of the military indicted for having committed human rights violation, the promotion of activities of the monitoring and reporting mechanism special team created in 2005 of the Security Council, and the promotion of discussion and analysis of transitional justice, the rights of the child, and enforced disappearance with other organizations. Let's see now what actions of the government on the ground and in the human rights context. To implement the National Plan of Development in the area of the human rights, the government of Colombia has created a fundamental structure whose main strategy has been the creation of the national system of human rights and the international humanitarian law. This is a decree of 2011, with the capacity to design, implement, monitor, and evaluate the national policy of human rights and international humanitarian law. The system is headed by the Interinstitutional Commission of Human Rights, is the highest organ of decision-making in this regard, which has the capacity to formulate policies and guidelines in the topic of human rights. It is integrated by the highest officials in the government, and it covers areas like citizenship, culture and education, human rights, civil and political rights, international humanitarian law and armed conflict, economic, social and cultural and environmental rights, justice, equality, non-discrimination and respect of identities. It is a very, very comprehensive mandate, and the different agencies of the government are fully committed with this implementation. As part of the system, Colombia is designing the holistic public policy of human rights and international humanitarian law with the engagement of the regions and the civil society, for which it has created regional forums throughout the country that have been coordinated by the Presidential Program for Human Rights. On this matter, I would like to highlight that Colombia has created the national system of attention and integral reparation of victims that coordinates itself with the national system of human rights in Colombia. There are fundamental strategies for the implementation of the human rights and the international humanitarian law. I'm not going to expand too much on this because the lack of time, but it is substantial strategies that have been put in place and are being implemented, and it covers all these programs of victim protection and integrated plans for the prevention and protection of violation of human rights, and of course the strategy of prevention of recruitment and use of children by illegal arms groups. I think that we could expand in another opportunity about the contents of all these aspects that we are covering, but in conclusion, I would like to say that the work of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Colombia has positively contributed to the respect and guarantee of human rights, as well as the current approach that Colombia has adopted on the topic of human rights. The Office support to the Ministry of Defense and to the Armed Force has contributed greatly to its effective development. In the same way, the Office has given invaluable support to the strengthening of the national capacities to respond and create conditions favorable to the full provision of human rights. The renewal of the mandate of the Office is due to the interest of Colombia in strengthening human rights provision, strengthening the links with the United Nations system, and maintaining a transparent attitude toward the endeavors we have undertaken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I very much want to make time for those of you in the audience who want to speak. We have two more speakers, and I guess I'm saying, please be brief. The first is Marit Kohanen-Sharif, the Deputy Head of the New York office of OHCHR.
Thank you. Actually, I was just asked to make comments, so I will be brief, not to make a statement, but I wanted to, so in view of Roger's presentation and what we've heard now, I wanted to say one or two things. One is a comment. I fully agree, obviously, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has influence on the ground and can make a difference. I've served in 7 duty stations in 3 continents in the different capacities, Human Rights Advisor, Regional Rep, as a representative of our office, and also in peacekeeping missions. So I can see that there is a value for a different type of presence in a different type of context. The influence and the leverage is different and depends on the context. It's a strategic choice also by the head of the office or by the person on the ground, which of the elements of the toolbox we want to use at a given time, which will be more effective. Will it be public reporting? Will it be technical advice? Will it be quiet diplomacy? Will it be supporting civil society and facilitating a space for them? So there's space for all types of presences and for all types of tools, but it's a strategic choice that has to be made in the field and depending on the situation. But also, there's one comment that I think doesn't really come out in the research, but that is implicit, but I want to emphasize it. Why do we have this influence? It's because the way I see it is that we have at international level the treaty bodies, we have special rapporteurs, we have a whole headquarters in Geneva that produces research, outreach, training materials, tools, policy guidance. But why does it make a difference on the ground? Because we have that outlet of a field office that is able to use those tools that are being developed at international level, including resolutions of the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. It's the field presence that is the outlet that turns these tools into reality. So in a way, I fully believe that we need to strengthen the field, but also the field can't do without those tools that are being developed internationally to make a reality on the ground. So that's a comment that I really want to say, because it's not about field versus headquarters or anything. It's about how to combine the two to make a difference. And I'm going to illustrate 3 really brief examples, not long at all, about the difference. Northern Uganda, northeastern Uganda, where I served as the head of the office, in Padere. We did a similar thing like in Congo. We transported a local judge every week in our car to a remote prison because he didn't have fuel, he didn't have a car. He held open court sessions every week for a year. During that year, we reduced the prison population in that prison by 30%. And in a context where over 65% of detainees are in pretrial detention, you can imagine what an effect it had on access to justice of those who had been in pretrial detention without access to justice for about 5 years. So this process took a year, but at the end of it, the government was convinced, through influence by concrete action of the field presence or influence by credibility and action, that they needed to post the judge more permanently with the resources in the area to help. So a concrete action that created credibility, showed an impact, and then led to the national authority replicating the example and doing it on their own without us. In Cameroon, a civil society coalition had for a long time been trying to access the elections management body to ensure that elections could be accessible for persons with disabilities. It meant everything from physical access, from the right to privacy, from right to freedom of choice, that a person with a visual disability could go into the booth alone, could choose, or with a person of trust, not with the military or the police or whoever was guarding the site. They had not had that access, and they had not been heard by the Elections Commission. Our office facilitated that access. We joined the coalition. We led the coalition for a while until the national counterparts, civil society and government, were talking to each other. And we had the last elections in Cameroon last year were the first elections where we had something like 10% of polling stations that were fully accessible to all persons with disabilities. So it's a small, example, but very concrete, that will be hopefully replicated. So that's what I would call influence through access, through the privileged access we have.
Thank you. I'm going to hold the applause for a second to go directly to Christian Salazar-Volkmann.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm in New York since the beginning of the year, and before in Colombia. I must say my heart is still in Colombia. And so I want to start by really congratulating Ambassador Osorio for the start of the peace negotiation in Colombia, and recognizing how much of a brave step that is by the government to enter into this, because after all, peace is essential for guarantee of human rights. And I will briefly just present a few lessons learned about the role of OHCHR in the reduction of extrajudicial executions in Colombia. We're talking about a situation since 2002 where allegedly army members killed civilians and dressed them up as guerrillas and presented them as killed in combat. Talking about situations where in a number of cases, middlemen even told young people, promised them work, they were transported into other parts of the countries, killed there, and then presented as dead in combat. And the estimate is conservative estimate by OHCHR that only between 2004 and 2008, more than 3,000 people were killed that way. So that was reduced massively in 2009, and I think reflecting on what was the impact of OHCHR in this reduction of a gross violation of human rights, I think first one has to really emphasize that the impact is subsidiary to the government's action. It is the government who took the decisions to change the policies in the Ministry of Defense, and it was the government that removed 27 militaries And with that removal of duty, that led really to the sharp reduction of extrajudicial executions. But I think OHCHR was instrumental to mobilize and support political will at national, international level, really for these brave decisions and changes in policies to be taken. Now, what did OHCHR do, the field presence in Colombia, to achieve or to contribute to that impact? Many things, I will just mention a few. First, providing evidence. The monitoring was essential. OHCHR Colombia office generated rock-solid information about a large number of cases of extrajudicial executions. The military would largely deny at the beginning that this was happening, so you needed to present information that was so solid that it couldn't be denied and that it created the awareness of the government that the problem was real and was urgent to act upon. I think a second lesson learned is that the office went beyond denunciation, that it established a dialogue with the Ministry of Defense and with many other state players, and that it showed some restraint in its media work. I think that was also an important part, not to close the doors for that dialogue. I think a third important intervention was the protection of the criminal investigations around these crimes, around these gross human rights violations, facilitating not just the contact between the Attorney General's office and the victims, the witnesses, the NGOs who had a lot of information and who were wary to approach the Attorney General, but also even through protecting trials by being present just in the courtroom. That protected and that strengthened the role of the judge, the role of the attorney, the witnesses. There's no time to go much into this, but I think that was an important part of the work. And then the technical assistance for the reform of the military justice system, an extremely sensitive area where I think OHCHR was instrumental in providing assistance for a new code of military justice, which clearly said that human rights violation cannot be seen by a military court. They have to be seen and investigated by the ordinary justice system. And so based on what we've done, again, because of time, let me just then briefly flag a few conclusions from this experience, which we're talking about a work about a decade. We're not talking about a short-term work. I think first, it's precisely this: results, impact does not happen overnight. So I think change needs time and long-term perspectives, and that's why I think it is important that really OHCHR invests in this long-term presence and that it abandons part of its of the idea of this ambulance. A gross human rights violation happens, you put some OHCHR people on the ground and then it goes away. This is not how you achieve lasting impact. So that's the first. A second is that results are possible if national institutions start to act. It is ultimately the action of the national institutions. So I think it is important for OHCHR to be very conscious that it is ultimately a trigger for political decisions. And that means that the skills of people on the ground cannot be only the legal skills. OHCHR field presences need political analysis skills, they need media skills on the ground to make an impact. A third conclusion over impact on the ground has to do with what was mentioned. The credibility is probably the most important source of strength that OHCHR has on the ground. And credibility, in my experience, rests mainly on three pillars. First, this excellent monitoring. I think it should be a key function of any field presence in the world to have this monitoring as part of its basic cooperation agreement with the government. Second, based on this evidence, you mentioned that, Roger, speaking truth to power. Now, speaking truth to power is easier said than done when you're sitting in a country office and you're dealing with this type of issues. And I can only say how important it is that speaking truth to power, that there is a full corporate backing and coordination in the organization. The headquarters, the High Commission, needs to fully back the representative to do this and to build up this credibility. If that's not happening, impact cannot be found. If a government, for example, or a human rights actor feels that this is the personal crusade of the representative, you're on lost ground. So you need that backing. And I think ultimately a lot of the capacity to have impact has to do with the international attention. And I truly believe that the annual reports of the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council ultimately are an important instrument that underlines this impact. And I think it is important that the international community recognizes how important country reports are. There's a lot of thematic reports on human rights, but the real issues are dealt with in country reports. And finally, the Colombia experience, at least to me, also shows that impact cannot be achieved alone. It requires alliance building with the pro-human rights forces in government, in the army, in the police, and it requires this alliance building and this coherent messaging with the international actors. For example, the reduction of extrajudicial executions, when we talk about the international community, would not have been possible without the action and the messages by the US government, the Swedish government, and the UK government. Particularly, they were important actors. If several actors come on with similar messages and support, then change can happen. In Colombia, I would say OHCHR has been an important partner, let alone the NGOs, I must say. But it's only if kind of an environment is created through these alliances that change can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. I regret that we are out of time, but I would urge any of you with questions. Thank you all for overcoming all the obstacles to get here, and particularly thank you, panelists.